We often hear the word intelligent thrown around, and a certain image pops into our heads.
Yeah, someone who's maybe a whiz with numbers or, great with words.
Exactly. But you've got to wonder, does that narrow definition really capture the full spectrum of human smarts?
That's the very question that Howard Gardner tackled really powerfully with his theory of multiple intelligences.
Right.
For too long, our idea of being smart was pretty much limited to those logical and linguistic abilities.
Hmm.
Gardner's work, especially his book Frames of Mind, which we're really digging into today, particularly with that 30-year retrospective he added,
Yeah, that gives some perspective.
it really reveals a much more diverse, fascinating range of human potential. Makes you think about all the ways people can be intelligent that standard tests just, well, miss.
Okay, so frames of mind, it's not just giving us a list of different kinds of smarts, is it?
No, not just a list. It's also about understanding where this whole perspective came from, its origins.
And what it means for how we see ourselves and how we learn.
Precisely. Our mission in this deep dive is kind of trace those origins, understand his core definition of intelligence,
Okay.
and really explore the implications. What does this mean for moving beyond those conventional, often quite restricted ways we've measured intelligence?
So looking at how they develop, how culture plays a role.
Exactly. How they develop, how culture shapes them, and the, exciting possibilities for applying this broader view.
So what sparked this idea? Was there like a single aha moment for Gardner?
Well, Gardner himself has said it wasn't quite like one sudden flash, more like various influences building over time.
Okay.
But the real catalyst, the thing that let him really focus and develop these ideas formally, that was a big grant back in 1979.
The grant.
Yeah, from the Bernard Van Leer Foundation. And they had this really ambitious goal to understand human potential, like in its entirety, and how we can best nurture it.
Wow, that sounds huge. What was Gardner's specific part in that?
His job was quite specific, actually, and really valuable. He was basically tasked with pulling together all the existing knowledge about human cognition.
All of it.
Well, what had come out of biological sciences, behavioral sciences, a comprehensive look.
Okay.
And it was through digging into all that, what we already knew, that the first seeds of the multiple intelligences theory really got planted.
And what was the crucial insight that came out of that research? How did he actually redefine intelligence?
Gardner lands on this definition. An intelligence is the ability to solve problems or to create products that are valued within one or more cultural settings.
Okay. Valued within one or more cultural settings. That sounds key.
It is. And what's so important is how deliberately broad it is. It doesn't limit intelligence based on like where the abilities come from, innate, learned, whatever.
Or how you measure them.
Exactly. Or how we should try to measure them. It really just opens up the whole perspective.
That's a pretty big shift from how we usually think about it, right? I mean, for ages, intelligence was basically doing well on those standard tests.
Absolutely. Traditional views were, very closely tied to performance on assessments that heavily favor logic and language.
Mm.
Gardner's definition just fundamentally widens the scope of what we even recognize as being intellectually competent.
Now, in intelligence research, you often hear about this divide, don't you?
Yeah, like social and cultural factors versus the biological side, brains and genes.
Right. So where does Gardner fit in? Is it one or the other for him?
He actually suggests they don't have to be contradictory. His view is more like it's entirely possible that, certain inborn neurological factors might predispose someone to excel in certain areas.
Okay, so that might affect test scores.
Right. But at the same time, the way intelligence actually shows up in our lives,
Yeah.
the roles we take on, the skills we use day to day, that's undeniably shaped by our culture and experiences.
So nature and nurture, essentially.
Kind of. Anderson even suggested maybe traditional views work better for understanding infants, but MI becomes more useful as we develop broader abilities later on. It's not strictly either.
That makes sense. So if we're moving beyond those traditional tests, how do we even start thinking about assessing these different intelligences fairly?
That's been a huge area of work, a real effort to develop intelligence fair assessments,
Amazing.
ways to get a sense of strengths without relying so heavily on just language and logic.
Right.
Initially, the ambition was maybe to create a kind of pure profile for everyone, showing their raw scores in each intelligence.
Like a neat little chart.
Yeah. But the more we understand how much context matters and how intelligences work together, well, measuring some kind of raw intelligence started to seem impractical, maybe impossible.
So the focus shifted.
More towards understanding how these abilities actually manifest in real-world activities, in context.
It sounds like this theory also fits well with ideas from developmental psychology, like the mind having different modules.
Exactly. It resonates strongly with that focus on different modules of the mind, specialized units for different kinds of thinking.
Like a language bit or spatial bit.
Precisely. And researchers look into the sort of constraints or predispositions within those domains, like how infants seem to have built-in assumptions about numbers or causality.
Or how toddlers just soak up language.
Yeah, the natural strategies they use.
Okay.
It all points towards these distinct cognitive realms.
Okay, let's dive into some specifics then. Linguistic intelligence, what's the core of that one?
It's essentially that deep sensitivity to language, sounds, rhythms, meanings, how it's used.
Not just grammar rules.
Not just grammar. Think about a poet, someone with this incredibly refined ear for nuance. They're not just picking words. They're weighing connotations, sound, flow.
Like Graves choosing call or Eliot's pillar and mouse you mentioned in the outline.
Exactly. Those examples show that profound sensitivity. It's about the artistry and the power we can wield through language. Something tests barely touch.
And it's not just understanding, but also creating, right? You mentioned Sartre finding his identity through writing.
Precisely. That Sartre story is so telling. He was brilliant at mimicking adult talk, apparently. But then he found this real sense of self just through the act of writing, even if nobody read it. It was fundamental to him.
Auden had a take on that too, didn't he?
Yeah, Auden suggested a young writer's promise isn't always in big ideas or feelings, but in their, technical skill with the language itself, their craft.
It's fascinating how reading seems so tied to spoken language.
It really is. Research shows pretty convincingly that written language kind of piggybacks on our existing oral abilities.
So if the speech part of your brain is damaged.
Your reading is likely impaired too,
Yeah.
even if you don't consciously sound things out.
But it can differ based on the writing system, like
Yeah.
pictures versus letters.
Right. Phonological systems like ours lean more on speech sound areas. Ideographic systems, common in parts of Asia, might engage visual or pictorial centers more.
So is language completely separate in the brain, a distinct module?
At its core, the sounds, grammar, meaning it does seem pretty autonomous neurologically.
But
But when you look at the pragmatic side, how we use language to communicate, understand intentions, connect, it gets less clear-cut.
how so?
Well, someone with severe aphasia, major language problems, might still get communicative acts across non-verbally,
Okay.
while someone with perfect grammar might struggle to convey what they mean if other parts of the brain involved in social understanding are damaged. So the basics seem distinct, but real-world use involves other capacities too.
Okay, let's shift to musical intelligence. Music feels like it taps into something really deep. How does Gardner define this one?
Musical intelligence is that capacity to perceive, discriminate, transform, and express musical forms.
Creating and understanding music.
Right. Think of composers like Stravinsky saying composing is doing, not thinking. Almost intuitive.
Or Schoenberg saying music reveals the world's essence in a way reason can't.
Exactly. These people have this profound, direct connection to sound. It's not just liking music, it's actively engaging with its structure, its emotional power.
And this can show up really early, but differently in different kids.
Absolutely. You see huge differences in young kids learning to sing. Some match melodies easily, others take way longer.
But culture and training matter hugely here, right?
Yeah.
Like the Suzuki method.
That's a fascinating example. Suzuki in Japan showed loads of kids can learn instruments really well from a young age. The emphasis was less on innate talent, more on character, immersion.
And cultural context matters beyond specific methods, too.
Definitely. Think about sophisticated singing traditions like the Ang tribe or the incredible group skills in Balinese gamelan music. It shows how much culture shapes and values musical skill. It's not purely inborn.
Music feels so tied to emotions. Is there a brain basis for that?
Oh, definitely. That link is universal and powerful. We think it involves not just the analytical parts of the cortex, but also deeper subcortical structures.
The ones involved in emotion and motivation?
Exactly. Damage there can sometimes lead to losing interest in music or the appreciation for it.
Like the musician who couldn't compose anymore after brain damage.
Right, or the one who lost the aesthetic feeling from his own playing. It suggests that emotional response is really deeply rooted in our brain structure.
So even if we see patterns in music, like in math, you're saying musical intelligence is fundamentally its own thing.
Yes. While you can draw analogies to precision and rhythm, harmony, the core mental operations in musical thinking, don't seem directly, intimately linked to the core processes in other areas like logic or language.
It's autonomous.
Pretty much, yeah.
Right.
Operating with its own logic, its own principles.
Okay, logical mathematical intelligence. This is the one people often think of first when they hear intelligent. What's the foundation here?
Piaget's work is really insightful here. He suggested it starts with, well, physically handling objects.
Playing with blocks, counting things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Manipulating, comparing, adding. And from those concrete actions, we gradually internalize the operations. We move from needing beads to doing calculations in our heads.
And eventually grasping the underlying logic.
Right. Understanding the logical necessity of mathematical principles. It starts with doing, then moves to abstract thinking about the doing.
But it's more than just arithmetic, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. As Paulney pointed out, even understanding a complex sentence can need logical parsing, not just language skill.
Poincaré wondered why math is hard if it's just logic.
Right. Suggesting maybe we forget steps in long chains of reasoning. Adler described mathematicians as loving abstraction, rigor, skepticism, and having this drive to create something new and elegant.
That creative drive.
Yeah, it goes way beyond just calculating.
And how does that differ from scientific thinking? Both use logic.
They do, but their main aims differ. Mathematicians often want to build consistent, abstract systems. Scientists mostly focus on explaining the natural world through observation, experiment.
Einstein's point about truth needing more than just math and logic.
Exactly. Empirical evidence is key for science. Bronowski called it discovering nature's secret. There can even be a slight tension math seen as too abstract, science as too applied.
What about those people with amazing calculation skills, but maybe not deep math understanding? The human calculators.
That's a really important distinction. Rapid calculation is often just one specific skill, not necessarily a sign of deep logical mathematical intelligence.
Like savants.
Right. Savants can do incredible calculations sometimes, but often lack interest or ability in broader math problem solving or abstract principles. They've mastered procedures, maybe, not flexible intelligence.
Whereas people like Gass were brilliant calculators and great mathematicians.
Exactly. A much broader, more abstract talent. And it's interesting, you can also have specific difficulties with numbers, like dyslexia with words, even in bright people.
It's fascinating how different cultures approach logic and math. Was it always assumed the West was ahead?
Not anymore, really. Anthropology had a big debate about this. Initial assumptions of Western superiority got challenged when researchers looked at thinking within different cultural contexts on relevant tasks.
So what looked like illogical thinking might just be different logic.
Or logic applied to different problems, or using different symbols. Think of medieval Indian math, using evocative words for numbers, or Islamic word number systems.
Even beliefs that seem primitive can make sense in context.
Often, yes. And Hutchins' study of Trobriand Island land disputes showed really high-level logical reasoning in a traditional setting.
Plus, our own ideas of math and science have changed hugely over time, haven't they?
Absolutely. From Babylonians, Pythagoreans, through the Renaissance, Kant, Frege, Russell, it's constantly evolving.
Okay, moving to spatial intelligence. What does that cover?
Spatial intelligence is about perceiving the visual world accurately, mentally transforming visual images, and being sensitive to visual details.
It's like navigating, piloting.
Yeah, or sculpting, painting, playing chess, even packing a suitcase efficiently. It's about understanding and interacting effectively with the visual spatial world around us.
So, not just seeing, but processing that info mentally, using it.
Precisely. It goes into more abstract stuff, too, like sensitivity to visual forces, balance in art, tension in design.
And metaphor, seeing connections across different things.
Right, like Lewis Thomas's analogies or Darwin's tree of life image. They rely on a spatial way of visualizing relationships. Arnheim even argued visual imagery is a primary source of all thought.
That blindfolded chess example really highlights the mental manipulation part, doesn't it?
It really does. Binet found experts weren't just remembering piece positions, but complex lines of reasoning and strategy, reconstructing their thought process spatially.
And this is something you can work on, like Hogarth training his visual memory.
Absolutely. Michelangelo probably had huge innate talent, sure.
Hmm.
But Hogarth consciously exercised his perception and recall. Leonardo advising studying cracks on walls. It shows you can develop it.
And it shows up differently across cultures, too.
Definitely. The Gikwe Bushman's tracking skills, the Kikyu recognizing individual livestock, incredible spatial abilities.
And the Puluwat navigators using stars and environmental cues.
A stunning example.
Yeah.
Gladwin documented their incredibly complex system, highly developed spatial intelligence in a non-Western context.
So while logical math gets more abstract, spatial stays more tied to the concrete world.
That seems a key distinction, yeah. Rooted in interacting with objects and space. Maybe why it's so important across so many human activities, practical and artistic.
Okay, bodily kinesthetic intelligence, the wisdom of the body. What's involved here?
It's about mastery of body movement, think dancers, swimmers, and also skillful object manipulation.
Like artisans, athletes, musicians.
Exactly. But also inventors working with materials, actors using their bodies expressively is broad, and usually involves multiple intelligences working together, of course.
It's about that mind-body connection.
Yeah, translating intention into physical action gracefully, precisely.
It's amazing to think about the skill level involved, that almost automatic quality.
Right. Highly skilled performers develop these incredibly efficient procedures. They anticipate, making it look effortless. It involves abstract programming of actions in the brain.
Selecting the right sequence of movements.
Yeah, coordinating all the complex neural and muscular stuff with constant feedback loops like eye-hand coordination.
Is there anything uniquely human about this bodily intelligence?
Well, our capacity for bodily dominance, or lateralization, one side being more specialized, seems uniquely human.
Like being right-handed or left-handed.
Yeah, and that strong tendency for left hemisphere dominance in motor control, which is probably linked to our language abilities too, suggests a unique evolutionary path.
That case of Joey, the mechanical boy who identified with machines, that's an interesting angle.
It is a really unusual way of relating to the physical world, almost seeing himself as part of it. Makes you think about embodiment.
How does our tool use compare to other primates in terms of this intelligence?
Well, lower primates use tools, but often infrequently, not very innovatively. Higher primates, like chimps fishing for termites, show more sophistication.
And what influences their learning?
Seems to be sensory motor development, play, experimentation, understanding cause and effect, that their actions make things happen.
And human tool-making evolved over millions of years, right?
Yeah, from simple choppers to complex hand axes. A slow, gradual development, likely passed down through observation and imitation. That highlights our unique capacity for cumulative cultural learning of physical skills.
And dance plays such different roles across cultures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Expressing emotion, social rituals, tribal unity like the Hopi, or individual expression like in Samoa. The variety just underscores how multifaceted and culturally significant bodily kinesthetic intelligence is.
So ultimately, using tools and objects well needs both body skill and spatial understanding.
Exactly. Coordinating that spatial awareness with the body's ability to act in the world.
Okay, let's move to the personal intelligences. Intrapersonal and interpersonal. Starting with intrapersonal.
Intrapersonal is basically deep awareness of your own inner life, your feelings, thoughts, motivations, strengths, weaknesses.
Knowing yourself.
Right. Discriminating emotions, labeling them, using that self-understanding to guide your behavior. It starts maybe with just pleasure versus pain.
But develops into more complex self-awareness.
Yeah, like you see in an introspective novelist, someone in therapy gaining insight, or a wise elder offering guidance based on deep self-knowledge.
Different psychological schools had different takes on how this develops, didn't they?
They did. Freud focused heavily on internal drives. Others, like William James or social psychologists, emphasize the individual's relationship to the community.
Seeing self-knowledge as important for social functioning.
Exactly. And then there are different views on early childhood development. Does self-awareness arise internally, in isolation?
Or does it come from interacting with others?
Right. The interpersonal or symbolic interactionist view, Mead, Cooley, Vygotsky, argues we understand ourselves by seeing how others see us.
Erikson tried to bring this together in adolescence.
Yeah, his idea of identity development synthesizes that internal understanding with our place in the social world.
So how do we actually learn this? It's not usually taught in school.
You're right, formal instruction isn't common and measuring it is tricky. But understanding feelings is cognitive interpreting situations. We learn through life experience, reflection.
And it might have roots in other species, like chimps showing fear.
Possibly, yeah. Hebb's work suggested that. And studies of people with aphasia show that losing language doesn't necessarily destroy personal knowledge or sense of self.
So it's not purely language-based.
Doesn't seem to be, no.
And interpersonal intelligence, that's the flip side. Understanding others.
Exactly. The capacity to understand other people, their emotions, motives, intentions, behaviors, and relate to them effectively. It's tied into that idea of self-knowledge developing through knowing others.
Empathy, social skills.
Collaboration, reading people. all that.
Now, culture obviously shapes our sense of self hugely. Different cultures, different ideas.
Profoundly different. Many non-Western societies emphasize the group, community, interconnectedness, much more than the isolated individual self.
Like the Maori identity based on group status, or the Dinka view of being acted upon by the world.
Exactly. That contrasts sharply with the Western emphasis on the individual as this sort of atomized particle.
So we have to be careful not to impose our idea of self onto others.
Absolutely crucial. A transcultural view sees the self as emerging, rooted in interpersonal knowledge, but heavily shaped by cultural context and relationships. It's a
And
balance.
some cultures might emphasize the individual self more, maybe as a kind of overseeing capacity.
Possibly. But Gardner cautions against seeing that specific cultural emphasis as inherently superior or more evolved. It's just one way culture shapes us.
Gardner acknowledges critiques of his theory too, right? What are some of those?
Yeah, a key one is that these intelligences aren't just raw capacities. They need to be embedded in cultural meaning and practice to really function.
Like Nozick's idea of dumb capacities needing to become smarter through social interaction.
Exactly. Culture and learning shape them. Originality is another complex area. It often comes from mastery, but isn't valued everywhere.
A metaphor.
Also debated. Logical math might help see patterns, but metaphor probably works within specific domains. Early metaphorizing seems universal, but its link to later intelligence isn't totally clear. So it's always potential interacting with culture.
The idea of socialization through symbols sounds really key. How do we learn to use these intelligences within our culture?
Symbols are crucial, the tools. Language, pictures, numbers, gestures, they mobilize our intelligences.
And this starts early.
Right from infancy, where raw intelligence is wrapped in meaning. Then preschool, kids get involved in all sorts of symbol systems, play, drawing, talking.
And then formal symbols like writing and math.
Yeah, notational symbolization, where culture's influence gets even stronger. Even basic infant actions involve multiple intelligences working together, reaching, finding hidden objects, feeling anxiety.
And around age 1, they start understanding symbols, like words meaning things.
Exactly. Proto-symbolic behavior,
Yeah.
entering that world of shared public meaning. Then between 2 and 5, they develop this first draft knowledge of symbols, language, pictures, blocks, dance, music, basic logic.
Through imitation and figuring out how symbols represent things.
Yeah, direct mapping, like imitation, and also analogical mapping where the symbol captures relationships. Our intelligences get used, absorbed in creating and interpreting symbols
And culture shapes which symbols matter, how we feel about them.
hugely. And sometimes mastering the established symbols can even overshadow original creativity. Anthropologists like Michael Cole really emphasize how we acquire symbols, ideas, ways of thinking from our cultural environment.
Education obviously plays a huge role here. How do different societies approach educating these intelligences?
Education in some form is central everywhere, as Jules Henry said. A basic mode is just observational learning, watching, and imitating. Spatial, bodily, interpersonal skills are key there,
Language is less direct.
often more incidental, yeah. Then you have instruction outside immediate practice models, stories, ceremonies.
Gardner looked at specific forms like initiation rites.
Right. Often challenging experiences marking transition to adulthood. And apprenticeships incredibly effective across cultures, even non-literate ones, for mastering skills like carving, sailing, woodworking.
And traditional religious schools.
Yeah, often emphasizing memorization, especially sacred texts, with a respected master teacher integrated into the community. Fisher noted similarities across places like Iran.
Then came the modern secular school. How did that change things?
Big shifts. Focus moved from mainly religious texts to all knowledge. Teachers became civil servants with credentials. Education started earlier. Families got more involved, females included. Goals broadened to labor, citizenship, personal development.
And the intellectual emphasis changed too.
Definitely. Less focus on interpersonal skills in formal settings, more on interpersonal reflection. Big emphasis on combining linguistic and logical skills, less on pure memorization. And spatial and bodily intelligences often got pushed aside in the formal curriculum.
And there have been critiques of schooling itself, like from Illich or Frere.
Sure, raising concerns about limitations, biases. Literacy itself had huge effects, encouraging reflective thought about language, precision, new ways to connect.
Cole found schooling had broader effects than just literacy.
Yes, though literacy enhanced specific skills tied to the script, like memory for bisyllables. And then science, as a way of thinking, became transformative.
With its empirical approach, openness to change.
Right, contrasting with pre-scientific thought that might justify existing beliefs. Comparing traditional learning in Iran with modern learning in Paris really highlights the need for cultural context when thinking about education.
So, how do we actually apply these ideas in the real world? How do we put multiple intelligences into practice?
Well, the core idea is that our intellectual abilities really develop when we engage in symbolizing activities that have real meaning within our culture.
Like language becoming speaking and writing central to jobs and life.
Exactly. Innate capacity becomes practical skill through use in meaningful contexts. The Suzuki method for violin is a great case study here.
How does that apply MI principles?
Well, it starts early, emphasizes learning by ear initially, makes the mother-child relationship central. It leverages interpersonal knowledge as a route into musical development.
Plus strong cultural support and lots of practice.
Right. And it shows both pros and cons, maybe. Amazing skill in learning from others, dedication, discipline, but maybe also reinforcing cultural distinctiveness.
Japan's seen big increases in physical metrics and IQ scores, too.
Yeah, suggesting early, focused education can have powerful impacts.
So the theory pushes for more tailored education.
Exactly. Making focused decisions, recognizing individual talents and weaknesses. Maybe apprenticeships for some, specific support for others, varied curricula for most.
Within resource limits, of
Of
course.
course. But acknowledging that potential. The Club of Rome talked about stirring dormant potential as crucial.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into Gardner's theory. So if you had to boil it down, what's the biggest takeaway for us?
I think the fundamental thing is that Gardner's theory gives us a much richer, more expansive way to understand human smarts. It's broader than just traditional IQ.
It shows intelligence isn't just one thing.
Exactly. It's more like a collection of different intellectual capacities, different ways to solve problems, create things that are valued by our culture. It helps us appreciate how many different ways people can be capable.
And these intelligences aren't fixed things we're born with, they develop,
Right. They develop and get expressed within our cultural context using the symbol systems that our culture values.
which has huge implications for education, right? And just understanding human potential.
Absolutely. Recognizing individual strengths, diverse ways of learning, it opens up how we think about helping people reach their potential.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to really chew on. How might understanding your own unique blend of intelligences and maybe the intellectual values most emphasized in your own culture, how might that shape how you approach learning, your own growth, maybe even your career?
Yeah, it can be really valuable to explore these different intelligences more. Think about how they apply in your own life, in fields that interest you. Lots to think about.